We have a very special program today, taking a look at India, one of the world's fastest growing economies, which we often label also the world's biggest democracy. Our speaker, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, or PBM as he's sometimes nicknamed, is viewed by many of his contemporaries as one of the brightest lights of Indian academia. One news presenter calls him India's leading independent thinker. He has a critical perspective on Indian democracy. It will expand our understanding of Indian politics. I hasten to add, though, that so will the story of what's happened to him as a result of his expression of those views. Pratap studied at politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, the famous PPE course. He got his PhD at Princeton. He was president for many years of the Center for Policy Research, viewed by many as India's premier think tank. It was famous, according to one columnist I read, for its intellectual honesty. He taught at Harvard, at India's Nehru University, and at the NYU Law School. He's currently the Laurence S. Rockefeller Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. He's written or edited books that help define Indian politics for the world. Among them, the Oxford Companion to Politics in India. He's a columnist for the Indian Express. In 2015, he was named the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University, a new private startup university modeled on the Ivy League. Many called this a perfect matchup between an independent university and an independent thinker. But he continued to write his columns as he taught at Ashoka, criticizing and administered at Ashoka, criticizing the government of Narendra Modi, the prime minister, focusing on the ruling BJP party, its resort to Hindu nationalism, its resort to the stirring of intercommunal hatred with the Muslim population. He continued to write on the growing authoritarian streak and on the seeming disdain of the government for the Indian constitution. This really got under their skin. 2 years later, he was forced to resign in the post of vice chancellor. The trustees of the university were getting strong signals, he said, of government pressure. Still, he stayed on as a professor of politics. But in March of last year, he quit Ashoka altogether. Here's what he wrote in his letter of resignation. My association with the university may be considered a political liability, he wrote. My public writing in support of a politics that tries to honor constitutional values of freedom and equal respect for all citizens is perceived to carry risks for the university. In the interests of the university, I resign. A leading Indian economist resigned from the university in sympathy. 90 faculty members at Ashoka signed a letter of solidarity, joined by dozens from Harvard, Columbia, Yale, LSE, MIT, and elsewhere. They said that academic freedom at Ashoka had been put in question, and they declared this: we stand in support of Professor Mehta and all academics who risk their personal and professional well-being by speaking truth to power. In addition to his criticism of the government for its authoritarianism, for the failure of other democratic institutions to provide checks and balances, in the minds of his peers, as you can tell from that letter, he has exposed at great personal cost and effort, in the minds of his peers, he has exposed the government's readiness to clamp down on academic freedom as well. It's lucky for all of us that Princeton has given him a temporary academic home. Professor Mehta, tell us about the perilous state of Indian democracy.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. It's a real honor and privilege to speak to this distinguished group, and I'm looking forward to your questions and learning from you. And thank you, Roy, for that overly generous introduction and this opportunity. And I must begin by saying that I think Roy was being excessively kind. I mean, to be honest, I personally do not feel that have actually put anything at risk, certainly compared to what a lot of frontline journalists in India are doing every day. In fact, I think we've been actually protected by the kind of privilege that we have a good deal. And I think it is worth kind of begin by putting that on the record. So Roy asked me to talk a little bit about kind of the state of Indian democracy, as it were, and the perilous state of Indian democracy. And what I thought I'll do is just kind of lay out the very basic argument for why people think this is a turning point in Indian democracy. As we all know, I mean, this is something India and the United States share in common. A democracy is always a work in progress. It is almost always a glass half full. And the rights and liberties and democratic participation that we cherish always has to be struggled for. Right? That's the history of US democracy, that's the history of Indian democracy. Right? So one does not have to assume a perfect democracy or a golden age of democracy in order to make the argument that there is still, nevertheless, something qualitatively disturbing about this moment in Indian democracy. And one could argue that there is something qualitatively disturbing about this moment in the history of global democracy. As many of you know, there is democratic backsliding in a large number of countries, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, just to name a few. Even older established democracies, the United States, another democracy I've had the privilege to live in, certainly looks much more fragile, arguably, than it did 10, 15 years ago. So there is something about this moment which is kind of, generating these concerns about the fragility of democracy and what shape or form the corrosion of democracy might take. Every single global index, the VDEM index that comes out of Sweden, just to take a kind of convenient reference point, is showing significant democratic backsliding, again, both in India and the United States. And so what I'll try and do in the next few minutes is sort of explain exactly what we mean by this democratic backsliding, at least in the Indian context. And some of the parallels with the United States, I think, will be obvious to, I think, many of you. So before I come to this particular question, what is it that makes this moment so fraught for democracy? And why should we worry about the future of Indian democracy? I think it is worth reminding ourselves that Indian democracy was a real thing. I think sometimes it is easy to get skeptical about the past. Indian democracy was an extraordinary experiment. The idea that in 1950 you could grant universal suffrage to an extremely poor country, uneducated country, defied all odds. And India always used to be the standout in the literature and comparative politics. This was not the place democracy was supposed to have survived as long as it in fact did. I mean, in all our comparative politics classes, there used to be this little footnote at the end. Well, we can't really explain India. This is just like a sui generis case. There was a big account of Indian exceptionalism. India went through crises in its history, most notably in 1975 to 1977, where there was a declaration of a formal state of emergency and the suspension of civil liberties and democratic elections. But that lasted only 2 years. And even then, the incumbent Prime Minister Indira Gandhi restored democracy by calling elections in the face of public protests and movements that persisted despite mass arrests. And most observers would agree that post 1977, Indian democracy had actually deepened and consolidated on every dimension of democracy. So, for example, India's participation rates of voter turnout, have been extremely impressive in the last 30 years. There were actually some elections surpassed the United States by significant magnitudes. The turnover of incumbent governments, right? And for American, I think, observers of democracy, this always comes as a surprise. In the period roughly from the late 1980s to 2014, the probability of any sitting legislator winning back office in India was less than 0.5, right? There was a 50% chance you'd be booted out of government, whether you were at the state level or whether you were at the central level. So if one of the characteristics of democracy is incumbent turnover, extraordinarily high, democracy provided a fertile ground for giving representation to marginalized groups, low-class. There were always political parties who actually spoke for minorities. How effectively we can argue, but there was at least political space. And the distribution of power in society was beginning to show the characteristics, hallmarks of a deepening democracy. Right? Ideologically, Indian democracy was characterized by what we used to call a broad centrism. In economic policy, it neither veered to left nor to right. In fact, that was one of the features of Indian democracy that used to have people exasperated, that there was a kind of institutional values were broadly heading in the direction of a robust liberal democracy. One difference between the Indian Constitution and American Constitution is that the Indian Constitution allows more space for group rights and recognition of group identities than the American Constitution does. But even with that caveat, the Indian Constitution is a charter of liberal democracy, with a charter of rights and equality, which is pretty familiar to any form of liberal constitutionalism. Checks and balances were deepening. In fact, in comparative constitutional law, it used to be argued that the Indian Supreme Court was one of the most powerful independent courts in the world. India had an independent election commission, actually an institutional device the United States could learn a lot from. This is a constitutional election commission that impartially oversees the conduct of elections, including the setting of boundaries for constituencies. So, for example, India has not had any significant constituency gerrymandering for years, right? So, in some senses, it was actually a robust democracy for all its kind of imperfections and its inability to produce the kind of economic development one hopes from democracy. Now, fast forward, come to 2014, the 2000 election of 2014, which was the election that led to the victory of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the current ruling party, and the election of Prime Minister Modi as Prime Minister of India. Prime Minister Modi won a second term with an even bigger and more thumping majority in 2019. And I think most observers would agree that these two election victories mark a significant watershed in Indian democracy. How so? And what perils do these victories actually pose for democracy? So one of the things that I think makes discussing the Indian case a little bit tricky in comparative context at this moment is that one has to make it clear that the government of Mr. Modi enjoys immense popular legitimacy. He has won elections relatively fair and square. There are issues at the margins we can talk about. He's an extraordinarily popular leader. He has cobbled together an unprecedented majority for his political party. Prior to the BJP winning in 2019, India was governed by coalition governments for almost 30 years. So he is a leader with a deep popular mandate, and we can talk about the reasons for that. Even if you look at the VDEM index that comes out of Sweden that shows India backsliding on democracy, the one indicator on which India still does reasonably well is elections. And up to this point, he sees himself as a popularly elected leader. In fact, one of the BJP's astonishing successes, and it's really quite an electoral machine, how well it can actually craft electoral coalitions. So when one worries about Indian democracy, one has to say this, perhaps with a heavy heart, that this democratic backsliding that we are going to be talking about is actually happening with, at the moment, great popular support. So you might say, okay, elections are still being conducted, the government is still popular, right? Isn't that what democracy is supposed to be? Now, the grounds for worrying about Indian democracy are the following. The first is that the ruling party, the BJP, which is Mr. Modi's governing political party, has two very clear political agendas, which pose a long-term threat to democracy. The first is the institutionalization of Hindu majoritarianism in Indian politics, in Indian culture, and in Indian constitutional law. The Indian constitution is by and large a chart equally. It seeks to dissociate over time the rights and responsibilities citizens have from the particular religious identities that they might possess. The BJP espouses an ideology which it calls Hindutva. And the core tenet of Hindutva is that Hindus must act as a self-conscious, united political community to establish a Hindu nation on the Indian subcontinent. Their reading of history is, and I think this point is important one to bear, which is that they read the past 1,000 years of Indian history as a history of the humiliation and dispossession of Hindus, first by Islamic invaders and then by British colonials. But one of the things that makes Hindutva quite unique as an ideology, that it almost regards pre-British kingdoms of India, particularly Mughal kingdoms, Islamic kingdoms, and dynasties of various sorts, an even greater humiliation than English colonialism was. Rather lay the foundation stone for a temple at Ayodhya. And in his speech, he said that the day the foundation stone of this temple is being laid for Hindus, as 15th August is for Indians. So the purpose of Hindutva as an ideology is to enshrine Hindu majoritarianism. It is to say that it is the culturally privileged identity of the subcontinent. It is to say that traces of the presence of minorities, particularly Muslims, their monuments, their traces on Indian culture, their impact on Indian culture, these are not things to be cherished. These are things to be erased. Right? The nature and structure of constitutional law must increasingly reflect the fact of Hindu political power. So just to give you one example, or two small examples, the BJP has accelerated introducing laws that regulate religious conversion in India. It has introduced laws that regulate interreligious marriage, where the argument is that Hindus might be at danger for some kind of demographic onslaught that minorities might orchestrate. it's a kind of mentality that's full of kind of all these kinds of conspiracy theories. But I think you get the general point, right? That it's an ideology that seeks to privilege the identity of the Hindu majority as the foundation of constitutionalism, law, politics, and culture. Of Mr. Modi's rule is that while he has a popular mandate, he is no friend of civil liberties. This regime is, if you like, acting in ways that are deeply authoritarian on almost every dimension one can list. In the past, in Indian democracy, we've had regimes that are communal in some senses. Episodes in politics, I should say. God knows India has had a history of communal violence. God knows in India, political parties have occasionally used Hindu-Muslim violence as an axis of strategic mobilization. Even the Congress party at the margins used it at some time. But for the first time, you have a political party that has made it a basic principle of the state. As I said, we've also had periods of authoritarianism in the past, 1975 to 1976. But for the first time, authoritarianism and communalism are coming together and reinforcing each other. So how is this authoritarianism manifest? There is a decline in some senses in every protection that citizens of a liberal democracy would take for granted. Right? The Indian Constitution, for example, right, does not allow for a conception of citizenship based on religion. This government introduced legislation that construes India as a homeland of Hindus, by virtue of which Hindu refugees can be granted privileged access to citizenship status, whereas members of other communities will not, particularly Muslims. I edited the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution, and I have to say that I cannot now walk into a classroom with a straight face and tell you what the Constitution of India is. The basic liberties we took for granted, the operation of habeas corpus, for example, right? The federal structure of the Indian Constitution, the allocation of powers between the central governments and the states, almost all of those you cannot take for granted anymore. So frontline journalists are being arrested. And frankly, they are in a far more precarious situation than most of us privileged academics are. Right? Opponents of the regime are being targeted by all the instruments the state can use, including the use of tax authorities and police and investigative agencies. You know, there was this little story in the New York Times that raised some discussion in the United States whether FBI Director Coney had been targeted by the IRS investigation of tax records. I don't know whether that is true or not, but imagine that happening on a large scale as a routine instrument of the state, where every single opposition leader, right, has some kind of police or investigative inquiry initiated or furthered by the state. Okay? So the range of civil liberties that you take for granted basically no longer exist. And I think this government is politically extraordinarily clever. Unlike India's past brush with authoritarianism, formal authoritarianism in 1975 and 1977, where a formal state of emergency was declared, this government has not declared a formal state of emergency. It's not engaging in mass arrests. Hundreds of thousands of people arrested, as happened in 1975 and 77. What it is doing is, it is targeting dissenters, opposition leaders, independent writers, journalists, as and when is necessary. Now, this strategy has two advantages politically. One, it still keeps the fiction alive, right? That India is not under some kind of state of emergency, right? I mean, after all, statistically, you can say how many journalists have been arrested? 250, 300? Doesn't seem like a large number in a country like India, right? But the message goes out. What it also does is that it kind of prevents the consolidation of opposition to the regime, right? Because many of us are still harboring the illusion that this seemingly incremental encroachment on our civil liberties, where you pick targets one by one, communities one by one, individuals one by one, is actually not going to affect us. Right? The minute you declare a full state of emergency, you could probably get more people to wrap their heads around, right, the authoritarian nature of the regime. But more disappointingly and more disconcerting, this collapse of civil liberties has been aided by a complete collapse of the checks and balances that you take for granted in liberal democracy. I began by saying that the Indian Supreme Court used to be one of the most powerful and independent courts in comparative constitutional law, and really had acquired quite a reputation. To my mind, the reputation was in excess of its actual actions, but it's indicative of how much power and prestige it exercised. For the most part, the Indian Supreme Court has pretty much caved in to every ideological design of this government. It has failed to uphold minority rights as effectively as it should. It has failed to uphold civil liberties as effectively as it should. It refuses to hear cases that are very central to the institutional architecture of democracy. Just to give one example, one of the ways in which this government has been consolidating power is by an instrument it created called electoral bonds, where corporations and individuals can donate to political parties legally. The peculiarity of electoral bonds is that the public will not know, right, which political party received how much money from which corporation, right? But somebody in the government does. Technically, the Reserve Bank of India does. But almost 3/4 of the money that is flowing through the electoral bonds is flowing through one political party. Now, this is an issue that is very central to the integrity of the electoral process. Right? The Supreme Court has simply refused to hear the case. It's just sitting on it. It's now been almost 3 years. And I think one of the big lessons for us, and perhaps something for the United States to think about, that any democracy that looks to a judiciary to save it is likely to be disappointed, right? A society in which the spirit of liberty has been extinguished, no judiciary can indeed save. And I'm afraid India is, I think, a demonstration of that fact. I think it's a demonstration of the fact that near constitutional formalism, right? The idea that you actually have a constitutional text, the idea that you have an institution, those two may be necessary conditions for protecting civil liberties, but they're certainly not sufficient conditions. I mean, I think that's something that's also borne out from US. But other checks and balances have diminished as well. This government is exercising extraordinary control over the social media as well. There is probably more degrees of freedom in the English language media, although even English language print media has had to compromise immensely. I mean, it's very difficult, for example, for any Indian newspaper to carry stories in Kashmir, critical stories in Kashmir. It's almost impossible for any Indian newspaper to now investigate corruption allegations against the government. Right? So it's the stories that are not being told that will tell you the story of censorship in the English media. But with television media, right, we are in an extraordinary situation for, again, our American colleagues. Imagine a news ecosystem which had only 25 versions of Fox News channel, right? And maybe one or two other channels with 2% of the viewership. Right? That roughly describes what Indian media is. Now, it's important to remember something about this media, that India has more television news channels than probably any other country. Most people are astonished to find how many news channels India has. But it's a supply side media. Very few news channels actually make money, right? It is the nexus of capital and the government that sustains a information order that is conducive to the regime. So imagine in the United States, if every major capitalist, from Jeff Bezos to Elon Musk, all decided to throw their money behind Fox News kinds of enterprises. And the nexus between capital and the state can be created by exercising state power. Right? Remember the tax authorities? Remember the enforcement directorate and the discretionary power of investigative agencies? So the critical mechanism of accountability that you need in a democracy, which is a free media, an open information order, is in some senses extraordinarily tightly controlled now. And not just tightly controlled, it has actually become an instrument for the dissemination of hate. Right? If you ever watch a number of vernacular news channels in India, some English ones, they are basically nightly orgies of hate, disseminating prejudice against minorities. There's no other way of describing most of those channels. So you have this extraordinary, I think, paradox of a regime that occupies, that commands an electoral majority, is quite popular, using every bit of its popularity to shutting down every institution of accountability in democracy. Now, the challenge for India is, I think, going to be twofold. I mean, just to kind of round up this story, I'll end quickly. The first is the following. One of the aspirations of this government, to my mind, one simple way of describing it, is that although it acquires legitimacy from a competitive electoral process, a seemingly competitive electoral process, the ruling BJP wants to govern India almost like a party state vote. I think a closer analogy would be the Chinese Communist Party. Right? What does the Chinese Communist Party do? Controls the information order, right? It insists that all disputes in civil society, right? All of the pressing issues, whether it be issues of cultural identity, whether it be issues of economic contestation, be mediated within the party structure itself. And so what the BJP, for example, has managed to do, really quite astonishing, is position itself as the sole custodian of Hindu identity. I mean, Hinduism is a religion known for its pluralism, its cross-cutting cleavages, at least its theological liberality, even if it's socially intolerant in various ways and hierarchical in various ways. Right? The BJP has, in a sense, positioned itself as, in a sense, the ultimate arbiter of identities, even in civil society. Just to take a very trivial example, or seemingly trivial, but quite revealing. The party has an agenda, for example, of de-Muslimizing Bollywood, right? Bollywood, India's most cherished, most powerful cultural institution, right? In some senses, exemplary of the kind of hybrid and free-floating culture that India had actually become. Just one example. And the way it will do it is through mobilizing vigilante and civil society. Imagine the Tea Party. Now, the question for India is, in some sense, is that once this kind of communal poison has percolated civil society as widely as it has, in fact, and in my lifetime, I have never seen an India that is, in a sense, so dripping with such open contempt and prejudice for minorities as India is currently. Right? Can this genie be ever put back into the bottle? And obviously, this marginalization of minorities is also going to produce different forms of ideological reaction and radicalization. Seeing some scant evidence of that. So the long and short of these 90 years. I'm using that decade as a benchmark, both in its European and in its Indian sense. European sense, think of Weimar democracy and its collapse. Indian sense, where in the late 1930s, India looked as if it had an extraordinarily creative national movement. Secular, multicultural, multi-religious, with extraordinary aspirations for creating an alternative universality. Within a period of 7 to 8 years, India was partitioned, right? In one of the bloodiest episode of violence in the 20th century, more than 2 million dead. And I almost get the sense that if you read Indian newspaper these days, it seems like out of the 1940s. The same set of communal conflicts now being played out, with the only difference being that now they're supported by the ruling dispensation. And the second question, which I'm sure, again, our American colleagues will appreciate. India's democracy has been fantastic at the transfer of power, right? That core meaning of democracy, the peaceful transition of power. Now that you have a majoritarian and authoritarian government in power, which so far is still winning electoral legitimacy. Suppose it were to confront a scenario where it might think it's losing power. Right? What would its reaction be? Will it simply behave like political parties have in the past and peacefully hand over the baton? Or will it play the national and communal card even more deeply and mobilize its vigilante street power and its capture of state institutions to hold on to power by hook or by crook? You're already seeing some evidence of that in the state governments, where opposition parties have won governments, and the government has still managed, the BJP has still managed to use state power to break those governments. In this case, using inducements, bribery, and so forth. But I think it is indicative of the fact that you cannot take a peaceful transition of power with this government for granted. Some kind of apologize for sort of painting a somewhat bleak picture, but I must confess that the state of Indian democracy does worry me. If we had more time and maybe in the questions we can discuss about opposition strategies, why this has happened. But I think it is important to wrap our heads around the nature and extent of the challenge that Indian democracy faces. I'll stop for the moment and hand it over to Roy.
Well, thank you. Am I live here? I hope so. My first question to you is that you've been very harsh on the Modi government, and I think you have a lot of factual reasons to say what you said. But can you say anything positive about the Modi government? Do they have any saving graces? India's role in the world has increased as a global player under the Modi government. They are saying the right things in some areas. I've heard that in the environment, for example, or at least they're saying the right things. The business has been attracted to India. The bureaucracy is maybe not overhauled, and maybe it'll never get overhauled, but supposedly they're trying. And sometimes he says the right things. Or is that hollow? Is that just self-promotion by the Modi government?
No, I mean, no, that's actually a very good question. It actually, I think, gives me an opportunity to, I think, fill out the picture. I mean, I concentrate in the sense of the perils of democracy. I would actually argue that the perils of democracy are greater precisely for some of the reasons that you mentioned. Unlike many of Mr. Modi's strongman counterparts, I think he's politically extraordinarily gifted. I mean, frankly, his ability to connect with them, his own social background and his ability to produce a kind of identification with them you have to, I mean, no matter where you stand on kind of his ideology, is actually a remarkable feat of political mobilization. So just as a political actor, the party political organization of the BJP is truly extraordinary. I mean, even if you look at it in organizational theory, testament to what they have built and how deeply they actually understand, I think, politics. I think on the economy, which is what your question was actually alluding to, I think my view is the following, which is, unlike many of Mr. Modi's critics on the center and the left, I actually don't think his economic handling is as competent as his critics would like to believe. I mean, it'd be a very neat story for India, actually, because then you would expect a kind of economic backlash to take over. Obviously, the economy hasn't done as well as he claims. It's not yet returned to, an 8% growth trajectory. Employment, and he made, I think, a couple of catastrophic decisions early on in his tenure, particularly when he demonetized all of Indian economy, took the currency out of circulation based on false premises about what that would do to cleanse the system of black money. But having said that, the management of the macroeconomy has been relatively prudential, actually compared to many other emerging market and developing economies. In some areas, particularly the digital economy, India is doing actually spectacularly well. I have to say, coming back to live in the United States after a gap of 25, 30 years, in terms of financial services, the digital platforms, India is actually leapfrogged ahead of the United States. In many ways, India has now got extraordinary state capacity. And this state capacity has been gradually expanding. I don't think that's entirely Mr. Modi's creation. I think a lot of it is the legacy of the 8% growth for 7 to 8 years that we got. And most importantly, and I think this is important to understand out an economic coalition for itself, was to emphasize 4 issues that previous governments had neglected. Sanitation, right? I mean, God knows India was not the paragon of sanitation, but the fact that he actually staked a lot of his political capital on improving sanitation. Again, India is not 100% open defecation free as the government claims, but certainly, I think even as skeptics will concede that there have been more gains on sanitation, on direct supply of electricity to households, gas supply to households, and the construction of low-income housing. So he's actually created a pretty smart welfare coalition. And these are things it's hard to argue with, actually, to be honest. So I think the challenge for Indian democracy is going to be that I actually do not think that the backlash to Mr. Modi is going to come from some kind of economic implosion, for example, of the kind that you're seeing in Sri Lanka, right? Where ultimately an incompetent, fiscally profligate government just ran out of steam. Actually, Mr. Modi is not that. He's quite savvy, on the environment. India is one of the few countries that actually, there's not a strain of climate change denialism in Indian politics, which is quite a remarkable achievement, actually. So it's a classic combination of a deeply authoritarian, deeply communal, right, but a suavely welfarist economic administrator. And that is what makes galvanizing opposition so difficult.
One of the characteristics we saw in the Trump administration is that President Trump seemed to have hit it off pretty well with Prime Minister Modi. They seem to be bros in the sense of just fraternal. It raises a question about Modi and Trump. How would you care to compare them? And we have a crisis, a significant lingering crisis from the Trump administration, which is being addressed by the January 6th committee. And the damage to American democracy, it turns out what was averted at the last minute is a huge catastrophe that is close to happening. Is there any comparison between Trump and Modi, or are they really in different orbits?
I think they are in different orders in the following sense. I think the 3 or 4 important differences that I think to bear in mind. One, obviously, Mr. Modi's social origins, which I think is very important to explaining his appeal. I think in the kind of identification that he actually fake that, there's the story about Trump kind of saying, I'm actually part of white trash, and somebody asks him, what do you mean by white trash? And he says, oh, there are people like me, except they're just poor. But Trump, in some senses, had to, in a sense, actively, I think, produce that identification. Number 2, I think Mr. Modi is the product of a very long-standing social movement. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that behind Mr. Modi is an organization called the RSS, which is actually almost a 100-year-old organization, one of the longest standing organizations, political organizations in India, although it calls itself a cultural organization, which has been building a movement for Hindu nationalism and Hindutva for decades. And there are various reasons and accidents of history why it turned out to be not as politically powerful as it is now, perhaps in the decades after independence. I think there's an interesting counterfactual. If the RSS had not been associated, at least ideologically, with the assassination of Gandhi, would it have been an even more powerful organization in the 1950s? In some senses, the assassination of Gandhi actually gave India the breathing room because it delegitimized the RSS. So Mr. Modi has a very long-standing social movement behind him. He is actually disciplined in that RSS school. He's extraordinarily disciplined. I mean, his personal habits, for example, are quite the contrary of Trump's. He likes to project the image of a kind of selfless ascetic in some ways, almost, right? And I think in his public articulations, as you've seen on the international stage, actually, there is a kind of propensity to play the wise statesman. Now, most of the people in India who've seen him operate up close think this is a mask. There's a sense that he's an extraordinary performer. But the very fact that he feels the need to do that, I think is really quite, I think, extraordinary. I mean, I think it's, so he's a much more sophisticated political operator in all of those dimensions. I think the only similarity, and that's what I was alluding to, which will have to be tested, is what would happen if it looks like the BJP is actually going to lose power. Under those circumstances, does he act like Mr. Trump, which is try to delegitimize a process, try to, mobilize vigilante groups in civil society? I think at the moment it's an hypothetical question, but I think that's the only point where their similarity might be tested.
Thank you. I remind our listeners that we welcome your questions. Just please type it into the Q&A box and I'll be happy to select from them. Let me put another question to you. I looked up the Freedom House ratings of democracies yesterday, and they do take an annual look at political freedom, at civil liberties, and India is ranked as partly free. So it's a critical location to be. With 66 of the 100 points that you need for 100 being perfect. Behind Albania, but ahead of Paraguay. Not exactly a great place to be. By the way, the United States is ranked as 83, and Britain is ranked up in the high 90s. Does this adequately describe the state of Indian democracy in the context of other countries in the rest of the world?
I mean, when one kind of puts one political science hat on, a lot of these indexes have serious problems, and particularly which variables they weight more than others. But if you look at a number of them, and the VDEM is the one, I think most political scientists kind of tend to rely on. I think they would agree. I think they would agree on 2 points. So first, relative to its previous position, India is backsliding, right? So whatever the weighting of the index compared to its own previous benchmarks, it's backsliding. And second, I think the phrase partially free does capture the paradox that I begin with, which is that nobody has yet cast doubt, or at least sufficient doubt, on the integrity of the electoral process. Formally, the electoral system is still quite competitive. And as I said, I think the operation of its institutions and the operations of its constitutional structure, the government would say, look, statistically, we are actually not doing too badly. This is not an era of mass arrests. This is not an era of sort of, in a sense, blanket censorship, right? But they have found much more effective and insidious ways to target and silence critics. And I think that is what some of these indexes are trying to capture. I mean, I think it's very difficult, I think, to capture, in a sense that, what one political scientist has described as smart authoritarianism, right? Where you can actually use the instruments of freedom and the instruments of law, right, to actually subvert effective freedom.
Well, speaking of silencing the critics, obviously in your academic experience, there seemed to be an effort to silence you there. And yet, you've mentioned the problem with the media being seemingly in the pocket of the government in so many aspects, especially television. But you yourself are able still to write your column. And your column is biting and caustic, but I would say it's extremely well written and thoughtful. And I sort of wonder, do you think that they want you to continue writing, because it's seemingly all the pressure they put on you might be winning you new fans, and I'm not sure whether that's in the government's interest or not, or how they really relate to you. How do you see the freedom that you still have to write that column?
mean, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think I'm relatively more inconsequential. I think, like any smart government, they would first, I think, go after people who actually matter. I think a lot more. Second, I do think at the margins, I think we are protected by the kind of privilege we have. I mean, I think we are in a kind of elite institutions. And frankly, it's not worth the headache in some senses. And that's not this government style. I mean, it does kind of work, as it were, behind the scenes, I think in some ways. It is true that I think a lot of my colleagues there are many colleagues I know who will not write out of fear. There are colleagues who have been targeted in much worse ways. It's very difficult to predict who and when they will target. So, example, I mean, I think one of the most egregious cases of injustice right now is this group of lawyers and academics that has been in prison now for more than 3 years. There's an academic called Anand Teltulve, who was a Dalit, radical thinker, really one of the most insightful writers on caste and politics in India. There's now evidence on him was fabricated. I mean, that's the degree to which the state has actually gone after him. They actually planted stuff. Independent agencies outside India have confirmed that stuff was planted on his computer. Sudha Bhardwaj, absolutely magnificent human rights lawyer. They've been in prison for 3 years. Journalists in Kashmir, or anybody writing on Kashmir. I mean, Kashmir is still practically, as far as the media is concerned, is in something like what a state of emergency would be. If you are a Muslim reporter, in the scale and one of India's best fact-checking websites. So, in the scale of things, I think there are people probably hurting, the government in ways that are actually much closer to the bone, which is not to say that I think opinion columnists might not be vulnerable at some point. But I think in the scale of priorities, most journalists cannot do investigative journalism in India anymore. Under the previous regime, for example, there was open discussion about corruption, as is healthy in any democracy. In fact, sometimes a lot of the discussion was actually unfounded, but that came with the territory. Try being a journalist and writing on crony capitalism in India. So, in the scale of things that I think matter to them, opinion columnists are probably, particularly in the English press, are probably a little less consequential at the moment.
Well, good. So I have a question here from Mark White, one of our members, which is that he lived in India for 3 years, had many fine mentors, and learned a hell of a lot about the country. But one of the things he kept on hearing was that there was supposed to be a census and a redistribution of the population according to representation in the central government, similar to the United States. And but he'd heard that this had not happened for decades. Very curious to know whether, in fact, did it happen? Was there a census?
No, actually, so I think what, Mark, if I may address you that way, I think you're referring to. So there has been a census. There's a census every decade. The census at the beginning of this decade was delayed because of COVID. So, 2021, 2020, 2021. So there has been a census every decade. The debate over representation was the following. So in India, seats are supposed to be allocated by population. But one of the consequences of that is that if a state does better at population control, right, where total fertility rate is falling, right, their representation in the central parliament would go down, right? Now you can see the dilemma this poses, because there were states, particularly in South India, that did economically well over the last 20 years, saying, look, we are being penalized for actually producing better development indicators, right? Our representation in central parliament will go down because we are better at development, we are better at female literacy, we are better at population control. So what the government then did was the political parties actually came to a compromise. They said they would freeze the representation, right, in the central legislature based on the 1971 census, right? So that the southern states don't feel penalized. Yes, it would mean that representation is not strictly according to the population proportions of the state, but that is actually a price you pay for kind of keeping the union together. And you hope that all other states will also, their fertility ratios will fall, rates will fall. Now, the good news is, and actually one of the most striking news, I think, in India is that India's fertility rate, even in North India, has fallen dramatically. Right? So most people think that this is a problem that will probably correct itself in 10 to 15 years. You actually don't need to open up this Pandora box.
Well, that's a bit of good news. I have a question here from Thorn Gould, who's asking, is India agnostic when dealing with the West and the Western countries, I guess, versus dealing with Russia and China? And there's a really current issue that touches on, in fact, which is Ukraine. We see that India is certainly a fence sitter, if that's the right word to describe it. And in fact, the global South is sitting on the fence and giving, it seems, an awful lot of credit, or at least listening certainly to the arguments of the Russians as they trample on the sovereignty of Ukraine. Does India see them, does it sort of try to balance them off as it did during the Cold War period?
Okay. So formally, India's position is that India is for a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. It has formally upheld the principle of sovereignty, but it has refused to outright condemn Russia. Right? I think India always was, I mean, even during the last 10 to 15 years when India and the US were trying to pursue a closer relationship together. I think India's traditional orientation of non-alignment or strategic autonomy continues. And the core tenet of non-alignment is you don't have to take sides in other people's conflicts. Don't let them define the terms of that conflict for you. Right? My own personal view is that I actually think India's position on Ukraine, India and China's position on Ukraine is actually a position of abdication. We have not taken as strong a stand on the obliteration of the sovereignty of Ukraine as we should have. And frankly, I think it's an interesting question. If India and China had pressured Russia more, would Mr. Putin's room for maneuver actually have decreased? But I think with the relationship with the United States, I think it's going to be complicated. I mean, I think the Biden administration, if not Capitol Hill itself, or even on Capitol Hill, as we saw 2 days ago, India has just got the CATSA waiver, which is, which would have come into effect for India buying, because India buys weapons from Russia. That I think the United States broadly is of the view that India is a force for stability in Asia, that India can potentially be an ally in the much larger challenge of dealing with China and in the Indo-Pacific region. And since India is not particularly in a position to do anything about Russia and Ukraine, at least that's what they did, I think would articulate, that in the interests of that larger strategic partnership, right, to let, in a sense, India's stance on Ukraine and Russia be? How long will public opinion in the United States and in Congress actually kind of tolerate this? Is, I think, an open question. But I think it's fair to say that I think the last thing the United States wants right now is to actually have a more deeper and troubled relationship with India. I mean, there's enough troubled relationships across the world, and I think Mr. Modi has read that very nicely. I think he kind of understands that quite shrewdly. I think the Biden administration, I think the last thing it wants is trouble with India. And so I think the confluence of that means that India will both continue to take an ambivalent stance with Ukraine, and at the same time, the partnership with the United States and other areas will continue.
Well, the main thing is India certainly is a player in the big game right now, and its views and its role are much sought after. So I have to thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was very stimulating, real insights into the state of democracy in India from a man who's taken great personal risks to speak truth to power. I think the fellow faculty members at Ashoka University had it right. I will tell our audience that in preparing for today, I read a lot of what Pratap wrote in his weekly column, and I also attended, at least virtually, some of your lectures, and I found them superb. I have to say that students at Princeton are lucky to have you in the spring semester. So thank you again to our distinguished speaker, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, professor, and thank you to all the members of the council for attending.
Thank you, Roy, and the entire team at the Baltimore Council.